Welcome back. If you are here tonight, whether you found your way back after listening before, or whether this is the very first time you have ever pressed play on something like this, I want you to know that I am genuinely glad you came. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever the hour is, whatever kind of day you've carried on your shoulders to get to this moment of stillness, you are welcome here. You can set all of it down. This is the Sleepy Griot. And tonight, we are not doing history. Tonight, we are doing something older than history. Tonight, we are telling a story. Not a story from a book. Not a story written by someone sitting at a desk trying to be clever. A story the kind that was always told in the dark, in the warm, with the fire low and the children already half asleep, and the elders speaking in the slow, unhurried voice of people who know that the best stories cannot be rushed. The kind of story that takes its time because it knows, the way old things always know, that the listener needs time too. Time to settle, time to breathe, time to let the world outside stop mattering. Quite so much. Before we begin, I want to ask you something small and lovely. Drop a comment. Just your country, your city, the time it is where you are, or simply that you are here. There is something I genuinely treasure about looking at that comment section and seeing how wide this gathering is. People listening from the middle of the night in Lagos and the early hours in London, and a quiet afternoon in Toronto, and a sleepy evening in Johannesburg. All of you, in different time zones, different beds, different corners of this spinning world, listening to the same story at the same moment. There's something almost magical about that. I never take it for granted. And if you are new here, truly welcome. If this kind of slow, warm, story-filled space is something your spirit has been looking for, consider subscribing. It costs you nothing but a single tap, and it means more to this little channel than I know how to properly express. Now, come close. The fire is low, the night is soft, and the story is ready. There was once a village that no one could find anymore, not because it had been destroyed, not because its people had left or its buildings had crumbled or its name had been forgotten by the maps. It was still there, every hut, every courtyard, every carefully swept path between the homes, still standing, still whole, still holding the shape of a life that had been lived inside it. But something had happened to it. Something quiet and strange and beautiful had settled over it like a second sky, and the world outside had simply stopped finding it. Travelers who should have passed through it went around it without knowing why. Rivers that might have pointed the way to it turned gently in other directions. Birds that nested in its trees sang, but their songs drifted away from any ear that might have followed them to the source. The village was there. It was simply elsewhere, in a kind of elsewhere that exists just beside the world we can see, close enough to touch, too quiet to notice. This is the story of that village, of the life it held before the stillness came. Of the night a stranger walked in from the direction of the setting sun with bare feet and ancient eyes. Of the sleep that fell, soft as the first rain of a new season, deep as the oldest river, over every man and woman, and child and animal inside those borders. Of the 100 years that passed while they lay dreaming, and of the one person, finally, who stumbled into that quiet place and felt in their bones that something here had been waiting a very long time, settle in, This one takes a while to tell, and that is exactly as it should be. Chapter 1: The Village at the Edge of the World. To understand what happened to the village, you first need to understand what the village was. You need to feel it before you can understand why what happened to it happened the way it did. Because things like this, things like the sleep that came, do not fall on just any place. They do not choose carelessly. The stillness that would one day settle over this village found it, because the village had already, for as long as anyone could remember, been practicing a kind of stillness. It had been living every ordinary day in a way that made it the right kind of place for something extraordinary to eventually notice. So let's go back. Let's go back before the stranger and the sleep and the 100 years. Let's go back to a morning, an ordinary morning, the kind of morning that seemed to the people living it like nothing worth remembering, because it was too familiar to feel special, the way the most essential things in life always are. The village sat in a wide, shallow valley between two gentle hills. Not dramatic hills, not the kind that announce themselves against the sky with rocky peaks and sharp edges. These were soft hills, covered from base to crest in a thick, comfortable covering of trees and grass, and the kind of low, flowering bushes that bloom in colors so quiet you sometimes don't notice them until you are right beside them, and then you can't understand how you ever miss something so beautiful. The hills held the valley the way two cupped hands hold water, loosely, gently, with just enough shelter to keep the wind from being unkind without ever making the place feel closed in or small. Between the hills, the valley floor was wide and flat and crossed in its lower half by a river. Not a grand river. Not the kind of river that has a name everyone knows and a reputation for flooding and a history of battles fought on its banks. This was a modest river, a river that knew its place and seemed genuinely content with it. It ran clear and cool even in the dry season, moving with a soft, musical persistence over a bed of smooth stones and colors that shifted from pale gray to deep brown to an occasional flash of something almost amber when the afternoon sun caught it at the right angle. The village was built in the middle of this valley, the way a living thing grows, not according to a plan drawn by someone who had never been there, but organically, slowly, each part of it responding to the part that came before. The huts were round, as they had always been, their walls made of packed earth mixed with river clay and dried grass, their roofs of woven thatch that hung low over the circular walls like the brim of a wide hat. They were not beautiful in the way that palaces are beautiful, not symmetrical, not deliberate, not designed to impress. They were beautiful in a way that everything which has been used with love for a very long time becomes beautiful. The walls were smooth where hands had touched them 10,000 times. The doorways were worn and darkened at the threshold where feet had crossed them in every weather and every mood that a human life produces. Between the huts, the paths were swept. This is important. Every morning, without being asked, without it being assigned or scheduled or organized, the paths between the homes were swept clean by whoever happened to pass that way first. It was simply understood, the way many of the most important things in the village were understood, without anyone having said it in words. A swept path meant someone had been there. It meant care. It meant that the space between people mattered, not just the space people occupied themselves. The village woke slowly. This is the first thing you need to know about how its mornings worked. There was no single moment of waking. No bell, no drum, no child screaming from a nightmare. The village came back to consciousness the way the sky comes back to light. Gradually, one layer at a time, beginning so gently that you couldn't say exactly when the night ended and the morning began. It began with the birds. The birds in the trees at the edge of the village started first, not all at once, but one voice at a time, the way musicians in a large group tune their instruments before performance. A single bird somewhere in the eastern trees, then a response from somewhere to the north, then three voices together from the direction of the river. Then, as the light grew more and more, until the air was full of sound so layered and so complex that it stopped being recognizable as individual birds and became simply the sound of morning, a single enormous voice made up of 1,000 smaller ones, each one distinct, each one necessary. The smoke came next. Someone in every household, around the same hour, coaxed the night's embers back to life and laid new wood across them. And the smoke from every hearth rose slowly through thatch and drifted upward into the cooling morning air. From the hills, if you had been standing there watching, which no one was, because the people of the village had no reason to stand on the hills watching their own village. They were too busy being in it. You would have seen the smoke rising from every roof at nearly the same moment, thin gray columns lifting together into the lightning sky. The village announcing itself the morning in the only language the morning understood. Then the animals. The goats stirred in their enclosures and began their complaints, a sound that was impatient and slightly ridiculous and deeply, warmly familiar. The chickens scattered from their sleeping places in a state of mild outrage, as if the arrival of daylight had once again caught them entirely by surprise. Dogs stretched themselves in doorways with an exaggerated thoroughness, each one apparently under the impression that no creature in the history of the world had ever needed a stretch as badly as they did in this particular moment. And then gradually the people, the farmers, went first. They moved out of their homes in the early light, carrying their tools, the long-handled hoes worn smooth at the grip, the baskets woven tight enough to hold grain, but open enough to let dust fall through, the wide-brimmed hats of woven grass that kept the midday sun from turning work into suffering. They moved without hurry, in small groups of 2 or 3, talking in the low, unhurried voices of people who have known each other long enough to not need to perform for each other. Their conversations were about ordinary things, the state of the soil after the recent rains, the behavior of a particular patch of ground that had always been difficult, the question of whether cassava in the far field was ready or needed another week. These were not exciting conversations. They were not meant to be. They were the conversations of people who were engaged in the fundamental, serious, and deeply satisfying work of feeding the place they lived in. Every word of them mattered, because the land they were discussing was real and demanding and required to be understood precisely, and the people doing the discussing had spent their entire lives developing the kind of understanding that can only come from long, careful attention. The fields themselves spread out from the village in every direction, pushing back against the grass and bush that would otherwise reclaim the cleared land within a season. They were not the neat, geometric fields of industrial agriculture, not perfect squares and long straight rows. They were irregular, shaped by the terrain, following the contours of the land rather than imposing a grid upon it. Mound for yams rose in rough clusters. Rows of maize moved with the gentle undulations of the ground. Patches of leafy vegetables grew in the slightly damper soil near the edge of the river, where the ground held moisture for longer and the light filtered to the overhanging trees at an angle that seemed somehow specifically intended for growing things. The farmers knew every corner of these fields. They knew which parts of the soil were heavier and held water longer, and which drained fast and needed planting earlier to catch the moisture before it left. They knew which direction prevailing wind came from in each season, and which crop stood up to it, and which needed the shelter of their neighbors. They knew, without measuring, how long it would take for any particular patch to recover from a harvest, and they rotated their planting with a rhythm that had been developed across generations of careful watching and careful learning. This was knowledge, real, specific, hard-won, irreplaceable knowledge, the kind that lives in hands and feet and eyes as much as in minds, the kind that cannot be written down without losing most of what makes it useful. In the middle of the morning, the children arrived in the fields, not to work, not yet, not the little ones. They arrived the way children arrive everywhere and in every time. Suddenly, noisily, in a group, with an energy that made every adult in the vicinity simultaneously glad they were there and slightly exhausted by their presence. They chased each other between the mounds and along the paths, inventing games whose rules changed every few minutes according to whoever had the most confident voice at any given moment. They got in the way of people trying to work and were gently redirected and got in the way again in a slightly different location. But they were also watching. This is the thing about children that adults sometimes forget to notice. Underneath all the running and noise, they are always watching. They were watching the way the hoe moved in the soil and the angle at which it was held. They were watching where the elders chose to plant and where they chose to leave fallow. They were listening to the conversations, catching fragments between their own games, storing information in the deep, reliable way that children store things they don't yet know they will need. By the time these children were grown, by the time they were the ones holding the hoes and making the decisions about which field to plant, and when they would know everything they needed to know, not because anyone had sat them down and formally taught them, though there was teaching too, in its time and place, but because they had been there, present, inside the life of the village, learning by proximity and repetition, and the slow accumulation of daily experience. This is how it had always worked. This is how it continued to work. Each generation inside the next, the knowledge passing through contact rather than document, through presence rather than instruction, through the simple and profound act of being together in the same place, doing the same things, in the way that people who belong to each other do. By midday, the village had found its rhythm. The farmers rested in the shade of the acacia trees at the field's edge, eating the food that had been brought out. A midday meal of whatever was plentiful and ready, wrapped in leaves or carried in clay pots. They ate without speaking much, with the comfortable silence of people who had just spent a morning working hard in the sun and who are now in the best possible relationship with shade and food and a few minutes of not moving. Back in the village, the midday work of a different kind was underway. The women who wove, and there were several who had a gift for it that went beyond mere competence into something more like art, sat in the shade of their doorways with their looms, passing the shuttle back and forth with a rhythm so steady it was almost meditative. The cloth they made was worn by the village and traded with the occasional travelers who passed through, and each weaver had her own particular style, a characteristic combination of colors or patterns that anyone in the village could recognize from 20 paces. The potters worked near the river, where the clay was best. Their hands moved in shapes that were half memory and half instinct, shaping vessels that needed to hold water without leaking, cook food without cracking, store grain to the humidity of the rainy season. This was not decoration. This was engineering in clay, developed through a lineage of potters stretching back so far that the beginning of it was beyond anyone's ability to name. The elders sat in the shade of the great tree at the center of the village. This tree deserves a moment of attention because it was, in many ways, the heart of the village in a way that no building could have been. It was enormous, the kind of tree whose age was impossible to calculate because it had clearly been old before anyone currently alive was born, and before the parents of anyone currently alive were born, and possibly before their parents too. Its trunk was wide enough that 3 people with linked arms could barely reach around it. Its roots rose from the earth in great muscular curves before diving back down, creating between them small hollows and sheltered places that the children used as forts and hiding spots and the setting for elaborate games. Its canopy was wide enough to shade a significant portion of the village's central space, and in the heat of the afternoon, this shade was a resource as real and as valued as water. Under this tree, the elders sat. They sat on low stools worn smooth by decades of use, or on the roots of the tree itself, or on mats spread on the ground in the combinations that conversation and comfort required. They were not doing nothing. It would be a mistake to look at the elders sitting under the great tree and conclude they were not working. They were doing the work that only people with enough years and enough experience can do. They were remembering, they were discussing, they were deciding slowly and carefully and with the full weight of everything they had lived, what the village needed and what could wait, and what was worth worrying about, and what would resolve itself if left alone. They were also telling stories. The stories began in the afternoon and continued on ordinary days into the evening. Not formal storytelling, not a performance with a designated teller and an assembled audience and a beginning and an end, more like the way water moves in a river, continuously, naturally, picking up and putting down different currents as the conversation flowed. An elder would say something that reminded them of something, and then the something would become a story, and the story would remind someone else of another story, and that story would drift into a discussion of the people in it and what had become their descendants, and that discussion would eventually arrive somewhere unexpected and illuminating, and then pause, and then begin again in another direction. The children gathered for this. Gradually, without announcement, as the afternoon wore on and the edge went out of the heat and the light began to soften toward gold, the children drifted toward the great tree. They sat at the outer edges of the elder circle first, within hearing but not quite within the circle itself, which was understood to be an adult space during adult hours. They pretended to play their own games while listening with both ears. Eventually, as the evening came on and the storytelling grew more deliberate and the fire was brought from somewhere and established in the center of the gathering, the children moved closer, and by the time full dark had come and the stars were fully bright, they were in the circle itself, tucked against the sides of grandparents and great-aunts and the old men whose faces were so familiar they were like features of the landscape rather than features of a person. The stories told around that fire were of many kinds. Some were practical, stories that contained, encoded in their narrative, specific knowledge about the land and its behavior. A story about a farmer who planted in a certain field at a certain time, and what happened to him taught, without explicitly teaching, something real and useful about soil conditions or seasonal timing or the behavior of a particular pest. A story about a woman who crossed a river in a particular way at a particular season encoded knowledge about when the water was safe and when it was not. The story was the vehicle, the knowledge was the cargo, and the vehicle, being beautiful and memorable and emotionally resonant, carried its cargo across time in a way that a dry list of facts never could. Some stories were about the nature of things, about why the river ran in the direction it ran, why certain birds behaved in the ways they did, why the dry season came before the rains, and what purpose this interval served in the larger cycle of the year. These were not scientific explanations in the way we use that term, but they were not unscientific either. They were attempts by careful observers to make sense of what they were seeing, to find patterns and principles and causes, to understand a world they lived in well enough to live in it wisely. They were at their best a form of philosophy, a way of thinking about how things were connected, what the rules of the world were, what a person owed to the rain and the river and the soil and the other creatures who shared the valley. And some stories were simply beautiful. Stories told because the human spirit requires beauty the way the body requires food. Not as a luxury, not as something to be indulged in only when the practical needs are met, but as a fundamental necessity. Stories of love and loss and courage and foolishness and extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people are placed in extraordinary circumstances. Stories that made the listeners laugh until they fell sideways against each other, or go very quiet with quality of stillness that meant something deep had been touched, or drift into the soft, half-waking state between attention and sleep, where the story continued in their own minds, finding its own endings in the private theater of the almost dreaming. The nights in the village were long and full of stars. There was no other light, no fires beyond the village's own, no distant city glow warming the horizon. When darkness came, it came completely, and the sky above the valley responded by opening up in a way that only truly dark places allow. The stars were not the hesitant, half-hidden things that people in lit places occasionally glimpsed between clouds. They were present, fully, overwhelmingly present. The entire dome of the night made brilliant with them, layer upon layer of light stretching back the distances the mind cannot fully hold. The great river of the galaxy running directly overhead in a band of diffused brightness, so vivid it cast shadows on clear nights. The people of the village knew the stars the way they knew the fields. Personally, specifically, with the kind of knowledge that comes from long attention. They knew which stars rose with the first rains and which set with the harvest. They knew which groupings pointed north and which pointed toward the river. They knew the wandering stars, the ones that moved against a fixed background to rest. And they had stories about each of them, long stories that explained their movements in terms that were also, underneath the story, precise enough to be useful for navigation and for tracking of seasons. When the stories wound down and the fire burned low and the children had crossed over fully from the almost sleeping to the fully sleeping, the adults of the village sat together for a little while in the comfortable quiet that belongs to people who know each other too well to need to fill every silence with words. They looked up at the stars. They felt the warmth of the fire at their fronts and the cool of the night air at their backs. They listened to the river, which could be heard from the village on quiet nights. A low, continuous, utterly peaceful sound. The sound of water moving over stone, the oldest sound in the valley, older than the village, older than anyone who had ever lived in it. And then, one by one, they went home. The fires were banked, not extinguished. left to hold a small core of warmth through the night that could be coaxed back to full life in the morning. The animals settled. The dogs found their places. The village arranged itself for sleep with the practiced ease of long habit. Every person finding the familiar hollow of their mat, the familiar smell of their own home, the familiar sounds from familiar neighbors, a child's murmur, a dog's shift, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a life well lived arriving at its nightly rest. And the stars turned slowly overhead, and the river ran, and the valley held the village in its cup-tanned hills, loose and gentle, full of warmth. This is what the village was. This is a life it lived, unhurried, rooted, deeply attentive to itself and the world around it, full of the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself but simply exists the way the most enduring beauties always do. This is what was sleeping in that valley on the night that the stranger came. He arrived, as strangers to that valley always arrived, from the direction of the sunset. The western path, barely a path, more of suggestion in the grass, was the one that connected the village to the wider world, such as the wider world was. It wound through the hills and eventually, after a long day's walk, reached a larger road where traders and travelers moved between the towns and markets of the region. Most people who came to the village came from that direction. They were usually known, relatives returning from a journey, traders carrying cloth or salt or iron tools, messengers from neighboring settlements with news or invitations. But this travel was not known, and there was something about the way he walked, something about the quality of his arrival as the light was fading and the first stars were just beginning to be visible, something that made the first person who saw him stop what they were doing and simply watch for a long moment before we can call the others, the children, always the first to notice anything new, had already seen him. They were standing in a small group at the edge of the village, very still, watching. Chapter 2, The Stranger Who Came at Dusk. There is a particular quality to the light at the end of a day in a valley like that one. It is not the sharp, dramatic gold of sunset on open ground, not the kind of light that makes long shadows and turns everything it touches into something cinematic and grand. It is softer than that. It filters down into the valley through the trees on the western hill first, losing its directness as it comes, arriving at the valley floor already gentled, already warm in the way that late light always is, but somehow more so, as if the trees had strained out everything harsh and kept only the kindness. In this light, the village looked like something a child might draw from memory. Simple, warm, complete, the huts with their low thatch catching the last of the gold, the smoke from the evening fires rising straight in the still air, the great tree at the center casting one enormous shadow that stretched all the way to the eastern edge of the gathering space and seemed, in that hour, less like the shadow of a tree and more like the tree's way of reaching further than its branches could. It was in this light that the stranger arrived, and the first thing the children noticed, the thing that made them go still in that particular way that children go still when something is genuinely unusual, was not what he looked like. It was the way he moved. He moved slowly, not the slowness of exhaustion, not the labored, heavy-footed slowness of a traveler who had been walking too long on too little water in too much heat. This was a different quality of slowness entirely. It was the slowness of someone who was in absolutely no hurry, someone for whom arriving was not a goal being pressed toward, but simply a thing that would happen in its own time. and who had made a kind of peace with that so complete that the hurrying had left him entirely. He walked with staff, a long, smooth piece of dark wood, not carved into any particular shape, but worn so smooth by long handling that it seemed almost polished. He did not lean on it heavily, the way a tired or elderly person might. He carried it more the way a person carries something they've held for so long it had become an extension of themselves, an extra limb, a companion object whose weight they no longer notice because it has been absorbed into the body's understanding of itself. His feet were bare. This was noticed. In the village, people wore sandals, simple, practical things, cut from hide and bound with strips of the same material, for walking any significant distance, because the paths between settlements were not always kind to bare skin. A person arriving after a long walk with bare feet was either someone who had begun their journey without time to prepare, or someone who was used to something the village could not quite name yet. The soles of his feet, as he drew closer and the children unconsciously leaned forward to see, were not wounded or tender. They were as worn and smooth as a staff, as if the ground had been meeting them with the same care a long familiar thing offers. His clothing was simple, a loose wrap of cloth in a color that shifted in the late light between deep brown and something closer to the color of the red earth that appeared in the valley's soil after heavy rain. It was old cloth, but not poor cloth. Old in a way that very good things become old, not threadbare or thin, but settled into itself, with a texture of something that had been worn through every season many times and had come through all of them with its dignity intact. His face. The children were young enough to not yet have a language for what they saw on his face. They would describe it to each other later, in the stammering, circling way that children describe things they don't have words for yet. It was old, they said, but not old like the elders were old. The elders' faces were old in the way faces were old, lined and weathered and carrying a particular expression that decades of specific experiences leave behind. The expression of someone who's been one particular person in one particular place for a very long time. This face was old differently. Old in a way that felt less like the accumulation of years and more like one of the children, the smallest girl, the one who was always finding word before the others. It felt like when you look at a mountain, she said, you know it's been there a long time. You just don't know how long. This was, everyone agreed later, exactly right. The elder who went to meet him was the oldest woman in the village. She was not the oldest by a small margin. She was the oldest by what felt, to everyone who knew her, like a philosophical distance, as if she had simply been alive so long that she existed in a slightly different category from everyone else. Her hair was entirely white and worn close to her head. Her face had been deeply carved by time into something that was, in its own way, magnificent. The lines of it following the paths of life so fully lived that they had stopped being signs of aging and become simply features, as permanent and as dignified as the features of the valley itself. She walked out to meet the stranger with the unhurried authority of someone who had been greeting unusual arrivals for many decades and had developed a complete confidence in the process. Behind her, at a respectful distance, several other adults followed, and behind them, slightly less respectfully and at a slightly shorter distance, the children clustered. The greeting was conducted in the way of that place and that time, a careful, formal, generous exchange because the hospitality that a village extends to a traveler is not merely politeness. It is a statement of the kind of people who live there. It says, "We are the kind of community that recognizes the difficulty of the road and offers relief from it." It says, "The stranger is not a threat here, but a guest, and a guest is owed care." The old woman asked the necessary questions. Where had he come from? Where was he going? Had he eaten? Was he well? She asked him in a manner of someone for whom these questions were genuine, not formulaic. Someone actually interested in the answers rather than simply performing the ritual of asking. The stranger answered quietly. His voice was low, not weak or soft in a frail sense, but low in the way of deep water, which makes almost no sound from the surface, but has considerable depth beneath it. He said he had come from far away. He said he was traveling. He said he was grateful. He said, and this was the part that the old woman turned over in her mind later when she was lying in her own bed waiting for sleep, that he had heard of this valley, that he had been hoping for some time to pass through it. She did not ask how he had heard of a valley that most travelers never found. She was old enough to know that some questions are better carried than answered. She invited him in. The meal that was prepared for the stranger that evening was not an elaborate one. This is an important thing to understand, because the hospitality of the village was not the kind of hospitality that requires elaborate preparation to be genuine. There was no running to slaughter a special animal or to bring out food kept for occasions. What was shared was what was being eaten anyway, the evening meal that had already been cooking, simply made to include one more, extra portions ladled from the same pot, a place made in the circle around the fire that already existed. This is what genuine hospitality looks like at its most fundamental. The door that opens without calculation, the seat that appears without ceremony, the food that is shared without tallying what it costs. The stranger was folded into the evening the way a river folds in a tributary, naturally, without drama, so that after a few minutes it became difficult to imagine the flow without him. He sat near the central fire. The elders' circle had gathered, as it always gathered in the evening, under the great tree, though tonight the fire burned a little higher and the circle was a little more awake than usual, with a particular aliveness that a new presence gives to a familiar gathering. People sat straighter. Conversations had a slightly different quality. Even the children, who had been told to give the guest space and were therefore crowded as close as they could manage while technically obeying this instruction, were quieter than their usual evening selves. The stranger ate what he was given with an attention that was noticeable, not the ravenous attention of someone who had been without food for too long. He did not eat quickly or desperately. He ate with a quality of focus that suggested he was genuinely present to the experience, genuinely receiving what was being offered, aware of the hands that had prepared it and the fire that had cooked it and the soil that had grown it. When he finished, he set his bowl down with a care that was not performance, but simply the way he apparently handled things, as if every object he touched was worth being careful with. Then he was quiet for a while, and the village, in its way, was quiet with him. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say, but the comfortable silence of people who understand that silence is not empty, that it has its own substance, that some things exist only in the spaces between words. It was the old woman who spoke first. She asked him what he carried, not what he carried in his bundle, though he did have a small bundle, worn cloth wrapped around something that had no distinctive shape. She asked in the way she asked most things, with a directness that was not rude but simply efficient. The efficiency of someone who had learned that getting to the real question quickly saved everyone involved a great deal of circling. "What do you carry," she said, "when you travel this long?" The stranger looked at her for a moment with those eyes that felt older than his face, which was itself already old enough to be startling. He seemed to be deciding something, not whether to answer exactly, but how. How to shape what he carried into the form that words require. He said, "I carry what has been given to me to carry." She considered this. She nodded. Not agreement, exactly, but the acknowledgement of a person who has received a real answer and is taking it seriously. He said, "Sometimes the carrying is heavy. Sometimes it is very light. It depends on the day and the road, and whether the place I am moving toward is the right place." He paused. "This valley," he said, "this is a right place." The old woman looked at him steadily. She had been alive long enough to have heard many things said by many people around many fires, and she had developed a sense, reliable if not infallible, for the difference between what was performance and what was true. This man was not performing. Whatever he was not someone putting on a show. He was simply present, entirely, somewhat unsettlingly present, in a way that the word usually isn't used. She asked him, right for what? He looked up at the stars, which were fully out now, the entire great sweep of them, from horizon to horizon, the valley's darkness making them as bright as they ever were. He looked at them the way you look at something familiar, the way you look at your own home coming into view after a long absence, with recognition, with something close to relief. He said, "Right for resting." As the evening deepened, the stranger began, very gradually, very quietly, to talk, not to perform, not to lecture or to announce. He talked the way the river moved, continuously, without urgency, finding its own level. He talked the way people talk when they have been alone for a very long time and have arrived somewhere they feel safe enough to let words come. He told stories. They were not stories anyone had heard before. They were not stories from any neighboring place or any recognizable tradition. They were stories about places the villagers had never visited and would never visit, about coastlines they had never seen, about mountains covered in a cold white substance that fell from the sky in a certain part of the world during certain seasons, about creatures living in depths of water so great that no light ever reached them, and they had developed their own, carrying it inside themselves in the permanent dark. But the stories felt familiar anyway, not the specific details. Those were genuinely new, genuinely strange, genuinely the product of a range of experience far beyond anything the village had accumulated. What felt familiar was the quality of attention in them, the same quality that the village's own storytellers brought to their tales. The sense that everything in the story had been looked at carefully, that nothing had been put in carelessly, that every detail was present because it was necessary, and every necessary thing was present because it had been noticed. He was someone who had paid attention to the world for a very long time, and the stories were what that long attention had produced. The children, against every reasonable expectation given the hour and the quantity of food they had eaten, were not sleeping. They were not even particularly drowsy. They sat in a ring at the edge of the firelight. Their small faces turned toward the stranger with the complete, unself-conscious attention that children give to things that genuinely interest them. The kind of attention that adults spend years trying to recover after the world has taught them to be strategic about where they direct it. The adults were the same. The elders who had intended to ask practical questions. How long was he staying? What was his onward destination? Were there things the village could provide for his journey? Had forgotten their questions entirely and were simply listening. The fire had burned lower without anyone tending it, because no one had thought of it, because the fire was not the interesting thing in this particular moment. The night deepened around them. Stars moved in their slow arc overhead. The river kept its own counsel in the darkness below the village. At a certain point in the night, not dramatically, not at any moment that could be identified afterward with certainty, the stranger's stories began to change in quality. They were still stories. They still had the same low, unhurried voice carrying them, the same quality of attention embedded in the telling, but they became slower, more repetitive in a particular way, not repeating the same words, but returning to the same images, the way a piece of music returns to its central theme, the sound of water, the feeling of stillness, the way the body feels when it has laid down a weight it has been carrying for a very long time, and the relief of the setting down spreads upward from the floor through every bone. His voice moved in a rhythm that the listeners found themselves breathing to, in through the nose, slowly, out through the mouth, slowly, the way the body breathes when it has fully let go of the day's effort and given itself over to particular work of rest. The old woman noticed at some point that the circle had changed. People had shifted in their positions, not leaving but settling. The sharp, upright posture of engaged attention had softened into something more horizontal. Children had listed sideways against the nearest adult and stayed there. The adults themselves had moved down, lowered toward the earth, as if gravity had quietly increased its claim on them, and they had found themselves without the will or the desire to argue. She noticed all of this from the place where she herself was sitting, or had been sitting. She realized she was now, in fact, leaning against a great tree. The bark of it was warm against her back, the way the tree always was in the evening, storing the day's warmth and giving it back gently in the hours after dark. She was not alarmed by what she noticed. This is a thing she would think about later, that there was no alarm in it. Whatever was happening had no quality of threat. It felt like nothing so much as a moment, familiar to every person who has ever sat by a fire in the dark, when the warmth and the sound and the darkness and the slow lowering of the body's defenses all arrive at the same place at the same time, and the sleep that comes is not a falling but a settling, not a loss but an arrival. She thought, this is a good place to rest. She thought, we are safe here. She thought, finally, in the way that the last thoughts before sleep arrive, fragmented, warm, without urgency. She thought that his eyes had been the most extraordinary thing, not frightening, just very, very old. And then she stopped thinking, and the sleep took her the rest of the way. The stranger sat for a while after the last person in the circle had settled into stillness. He sat in the way he had arrived, unhurried, quiet, with a quality of complete presence that had characterized everything about him from the first moment the children had seen him walking out of the dying light. He sat, and he looked at the people around him, the elders with their white hair soft in the firelight, The younger adults curled around sleeping children. The children themselves nested against their parents with a boneless, absolute surrender to sleep that only children and the very old ever fully achieve. He looked at the great tree above him, its canopy spreading dark and enormous against the stars themselves brilliant and indifferent and permanent in a way that makes everything beneath them feel both very small and somehow very safe. He looked at the huts and the swept paths and the clay pots set carefully beside doorways. He looked at the fields beyond the village where the last of the night breeze moved through the maze in slow, whispering waves. He looked at the river, which he could not see from where he sat but could hear, that low, continuous, foundational sound, the voice of the valley underneath everything else. He was quiet for a long time, and then, with the same unhurried care that characterized everything he did, he reached into the worn cloth bundle at his side and took something from it. What it was, this is the part of the story where words become slightly insufficient. The people who heard this story later, told by the traveler who would one day find the village, describe it differently each time. A handful of something that shimmered like dust in the firelight. A small object like a seed or several seeds. A breath released from a closed hand. A sound, too low to hear with ears but felt somewhere else. Perhaps all of these things. Perhaps none of them exactly. What can be said is what happened next. He opened his hand over the fire. The fire, which had been burning low, responded, not with a flare of heat or dramatic brightening, but with the opposite. It softened. It moved from the orange gold of burning into something deeper, quieter, a color closer to the embers beneath, the deep, patient red of something that has finished its combustion and found its way to the stable, enduring warmth that lies on the other side of flame. The light that came from it after that was different, softer, more the quality of reflected warmth than of active burning. The kind of light that exists in a room when someone has drawn the curtains against the afternoon sun, and the air inside has become amber and close, and the world outside has reduced itself to a soft suggestion. The stranger watched the fire for a moment more. Then he picked up his staff. He stood slowly, fully, with the ease of someone whose body had made its peace with rising and sitting and rising again across more repetitions than most people accumulate in a lifetime. He adjusted the bundle at his shoulder. He looked once more at the sleeping circle. He said something very softly, so softly it was barely a sound at all, more like the shape a sound leaves behind after it's finished. Whatever he said, it was short, a few syllables, no more. It had the quality of a wish or a blessing, or the closing words of a very long story that has finally found its proper ending. Then he walked away. He walked west, back the way he had come, along the barely there suggestion of a path through the grass, toward the western hill, toward the place where the sun had gone down and left this quiet amber aftermath behind. He did not look back. His staff made no sound on the earth. His bare feet left no marks in the dry grass that anyone later would be able to follow. The valley held the sleeping village. The stars turned. The river ran. And in every hut, in every dwelling, in every place where a person had been lying down or sitting or standing when the sleep arrived, the sleep deepened further, moved past the ordinary sleep of an ordinary night into something older and quieter and more complete. The animals in their enclosures settled without sound. The dogs lay down. The chickens, uncharacteristically, stilled entirely. Even the smoke from the bank fires stopped rising. Even the wind, what little there had been went elsewhere. The valley cupped the village in its hills, and the hills held their breath, and the whole of that small world went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not with the quiet of emptiness, but with the quiet of absolute, entire, perfect rest. It was the kind of quiet that feels, when you stand at the edge of it, less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a thing in its own right, something that has arrived and settled and intends for a while to stay. The sleep had come, and it brought with it something the village had always cultivated but never fully arrived at in the ordinary business of its days. A stillness so complete, so deep, so genuinely restful that the word sleep seems almost too small for it. This was something more like what the earth does in the depths of winter, what the seed does in the ground before it knows it is a seed, what the river does in the hour before dawn when its surface is so calm it holds the stars without shaking them. The stranger's footsteps faded into the western dark. The valley settled, and 100 years began to pass. Chapter 3, The Gift of Stillness. There is a moment in the deepest part of any true sleep where the body forgets it is a body, not in a frightening way, not in the way of illness or injury, where the forgetting comes with cold and confusion, and a particular fear of a self that cannot locate itself. This forgetting is different. It is a forgetting that happens when every muscle has released every last thing it was holding, when the jaw unclenches and the shoulders drop and the hands open and the breath slows to something barely distinguishable from the breathing of the earth itself, when the mind, which spends its waking hours in a state of constant narration, telling itself the story of what is happening, what happened, what might happen next, finally runs out of words and goes still. That moment, the one just past the edge of ordinary sleep, where the self becomes briefly, blissfully uncertain of its own borders, where it is not entirely clear where the body ends and the mat beneath it begins, where the sound of the world, the river, the wind, the distant call of a night bird, are received not as information to be processed, but as texture, as atmosphere, as a felt quality of simply existing inside a world that is also in its own way resting. That is the moment the village arrived at on the night the stranger left. And unlike the ordinary sleeper, who passes through that moment briefly on the way to dreams and then, some hours later, is pulled back up toward waking by hunger or light or the accumulated pressure of bladder and a day's worth of responsibilities. The village stayed there. It stayed in that moment the way water stays in a still pool, not frozen, not stopped, still moving. Technically, the slow circulation of blood, the gentle expansion and contraction of lungs, the imperceptible growth of hair and nail that continues even in the deepest rest, still alive, entirely and completely alive, but arrived finally at a stillness so perfect that the difference between this and not stillness was a difference between a held breath and a released one. They had released, all of them, every man and woman and child and elder, every dog curled in a doorway, and every goat settled in an enclosure, and every chicken with its head tucked into its own feathers, and every small creature that lived in the thatch and the spaces between the walls and the cool dark under the raised storage platforms. All of it, the entire living community of that valley, exhaled at once, and the exhale became the sleep, and the sleep became something that had no good name in any language the village had ever spoken. The fire burned down slowly through the rest of that night. Not out, not entirely. Even as the last visible flame diminished and the wood collapsed into itself in a quiet way that burned with collapses, the embers beneath held. They held the way the oldest things hold. Not dramatically, not with effort, but with the patient, absolute certainty of something that has been doing what it does for a very long time and sees no particular reason to stop. By the time the first gray light of morning began to feel its way down into the valley from the eastern hill, the embers were the only warm light in the village. Everything else was still. The huts were still. The paths were still. The great tree at the center of the gathering space stood in the pre-dawn gray with its enormous canopy absolutely motionless, every leaf hanging without tremor, the whole vast reach of it as quiet as if it had been painted rather than grown. The light came slowly, the way it always came into that valley, filtered first, softened, arriving gently as if it understood that a gradual entrance was more welcome than a sudden one. It moved from gray to the particular pale blue of very early morning, and then, as the sun found the angle it needed to clear the eastern hill, into gold. The gold fell across the village the way it always did. It touched the western-facing walls of the huts first and moved slowly eastward. It caught the top of the great tree before it reached the ground, making the highest leaves luminous and almost transparent. It reached the swept paths and the clay pots by the doorways, and the tools leaning against walls, and the cold remains of the central fire. Everything it touched looked exactly as it always looked in the first light of a morning, except nothing moved. No one came to the doorways. No fires were coaxed back to life. No goats raised their voices in complaint. No chickens erupted into their usual morning outrage. The birds in the trees at the valley's edge sang. They had not been included in the sleep, those birds, and they sang with their usual elaborate morning industry, filling the air with sound. But no one in the village turned toward the sound or registered it or let it pull them, as it always had, from the warm dark of sleep toward the cooler light of waking. The morning passed over the village like a river over a stone, touching it everywhere, moving around it, leaving it entirely unchanged. Inside the huts, the sleeping was extraordinary to behold. Not that anyone was there to behold it, but if they had been, if some outside observer had moved quietly through the village in that first morning and looked into the open doorways and seen what the light revealed inside, they would have seen something that required a moment to understand. The people were sleeping as people sleep, naturally, comfortably, in the positions their bodies had found of their own accord. An elder on her sleeping mat with one hand resting open beside her face, the fingers slightly curled in the way that a hand rests when every intention has left it. A young man on his side, knees slightly drawn up, the expression on his face one of such complete absence of tension that it looked not dead, nothing so cold or so final, but rather like someone who had set down a burden so completely they had forgotten it had ever existed. A mother and a small child together on the same mat. The child tucked against the mother's chest in the way that children tuck themselves against their mothers when they feel, in the wordless and animal way of very young children, that this is the safest available location in the world. The mother's arm across the child, not gripping, just resting, just present. The two of them breathing in the same slow rhythm, their chests rising and falling together with the synchrony of people who have spent enough time close to each other that their bodies have learned each other's pace. There was no distress in any of it, No furrowed brow or clenched jaw, or the small, unconscious grimaces that ordinary sleep sometimes produces when the mind, even in rest, is still working through something unresolved. The faces of the sleeping village were, without exception, the faces of people who had arrived somewhere they did not need to leave. In the oldest woman's hut, she lay on her sleeping mat with both hands open at her sides, palms upward, the posture, though she had not chosen it consciously, of someone receiving something. Her white hair was spread softly around her head and her face, already magnificent with its decades of careful lines, had relaxed into something that added one more dimension to its dignity. She looked, in that sleep, less like a very old woman and more like a very old tree, rooted, patient, full of something that would take a long time to fully understand. In the children's area, the part of the village where the families with young children lived closest to each other, forming their own informal community within the larger one, the sleeping was softer. Children sleep differently from adults even in ordinary circumstances. There is more movement in it, more expression, more the working through that children's minds do while their bodies rest. A leg thrown sideways across a mat, a hand finding a face and resting there, fingers against a cheek in a gesture of unconscious self-comfort. Small murmurs, not words, not quite sounds, something in between, the vocal equivalent of a settling. These children were dreaming. This was clear in a way that dreaming is always clear in children. The subtle animation of face engaged with an interior world. The small movements that are responses to things happening in a space no one else can enter. Where the adult's sleep was still, the children's was gently alive with the business of their own inner landscapes. Whatever they were dreaming, it seemed, from every observable indication, to be good. The quality of their small faces in the sleep was the quality of children in the middle of a game they are winning, or a story they are hearing for the first time and finding wonderful. The village dreamed, not the adults, perhaps, or not in the visible, animated way of the children, but somewhere in the great, collective depth of the sleep that had settled over that valley, something was happening that was not merely rest. Something that was rest and more than rest simultaneously. The way the soil is resting in the dry season, still, apparently inactive, apparently empty, but secretly, silently, doing the slow work of becoming ready, holding warmth, holding water, processing and composting and reorganizing the dark, preparing for a particular explosion of growth that will come when the rains finally arrive and the readiness that has been building all along finally has the conditions it needs to show itself. The village was resting the way a seed rests, full of everything it needed, going nowhere, patient as the earth it rested in. The first day passed. The sun moved its full arc across the sky above the valley, from the eastern hill over the sleeping rooftops to the western hill and down. The light changed its quality and its angle through every hour of the day, doing to the village what it always did, warming in the morning, dried at midday, gilding in the afternoon, releasing it gently into the blue shadow of evening. The river ran. The birds sang and fell silent and sang again. A herd of small antelope that sometimes came into the valley's edges to drink from the river came that afternoon and drank and lifted their heads and looked at the village from across the water and returned to drinking. Their eyes were incurious. The village's stillness was not, to them, alarming. It was simply the quality of that particular afternoon. The stars came out, the fire's embers, which had been holding all day in the quiet way of patient things, finally gave their last warmth to the surrounding air and went dark. Not dramatically, not with a final glow and a surrender, simply by continuing the process they had been engaged in all day, arriving eventually at the place where the last of what they had to give had been given, and resting. The village was now lit only by stars, and this, too, passed over it gently and left it unchanged. The second morning, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, each one arriving with the same slow gold over the eastern hill, the same birds, the same river sound rising to the cool air, each one finding the village exactly as the last had left it, whole, still, breathing, dreaming. By the end of the first week, the first very small signs of something changing had begun to appear, not in the people, not in the sleeping, breathing, dreaming inhabitants of those huts, in everything around them. A thin green tendril had appeared at the base of the central fire's cold hearth. It had found, in the ash and the turned earth around the fire ring, a combination of minerals and moisture that it found favorable, and was doing what living things do when they find favorable conditions. It was growing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but with the absolute conviction of something that has no doubt about its purpose. Along the swept paths, the first thin suggestions of grass were beginning to reclaim the edges, not dramatically, not the sudden overgrowth of abandonment, which is a different process, faster and more aggressive. This was the same grass that the village had always kept back, growing at the same steady pace it had always grown, now simply meeting no resistance. The broom that had swept these paths every morning was leaning against the wall inside a doorway, and no hand was reaching for it, and the grass was doing what grass does when no hand reaches for a broom, on the roof of the largest hut, the one belonging to the elder circle, the one used for meetings and decisions and the formal telling of the important stories. A bird had landed and was considering the thatch with a professional interest. It pecked once, experimentally. It found what it was looking for. The dry grass of the thatch was excellent nesting material, and it departed with a small piece of it in its beak, heading for the trees at the valley's edge. It would be back. These were small things, barely noticeable. The kind of changes that happen at the edges of a place before the larger changes become apparent. The kind that, if anyone had been watching, would have required careful attention to detect. But they were the beginning of something. The first breath of a conversation between the village and the natural world that surrounded it. A conversation that, over the years ahead, would grow gradually more complex and more intimate as the boundary between the built place and the living world that pressed against it from every direction began, slowly and gently and without malice, to soften. A month passed. The tendril at the base of the fire hearth had become a small plant. Nothing dramatic, a modest thing with oval leaves the color of new growth. The kind of plant that grows wherever it is given an opening and asks very little of the world in return. But it was there and it was growing, and its roots were finding the spaces between the stones of the fire ring and beginning, very gently, to know them. The paths were now clearly inhabited by grass at their edges, still passable, still recognizable as paths, still holding the shape that generations of footsteps had pressed into the earth. but softer at the margins, less defined, as if the village were allowing itself, in some small measure, to exhale. The bird that had visited the thatch roof had built its nest in a tree near the edge of the village and had raised its first clutch of eggs within sight of the sleeping elder's hut. The hatchlings, four of them small and insistent and possessed of an appetite entirely disproportionate to their size, had fledged and gone. The nest remained, as nests do, for whatever came next. Inside the huts, the sleeping continued undisturbed. The air inside was warm and still and had developed a quality that was neither stuffy nor stale, but simply enclosed, like the air inside a clay pot sealed with a well-fitted lid, like the air at the center of something. The people breathed it in and breathed it out again, and it circled through them and returned, slightly warmer, slightly changed, and then circled again, a closed system, gently sustaining itself. On the clearest nights, when the moon was full and its light came over the valley in that particular silver that moonlight makes of ordinary things, the village looked, from the hills above, if anyone had been there to look, like something sleeping under a spell, which, in every sense that mattered, it was. The moonlight moved across the rooftops and the silent paths and the cold hearth and the great tree and the faces of people visible through open doorways, and it touched each of these things with the same impartial, gentle attention that moonlight always brings to the world, finding the essential shape of things and making them visible without comment or judgment. 3 months in, the river shifted. Not dramatically. Rivers shift gradually, by inches over long periods, as the small variations in their bed and banks accumulate into larger changes of course. But in that 3rd month, the particular curve of the river closest to the village moved slightly eastward. Only a person who had watched it carefully for years would have noticed it. And there was no such person now to watch. The river simply did what rivers do. It followed the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance led it, by a small and unhurried degree, closer to the eastern edge of the village's fields. This had consequences, eventually, but they were slow consequences, and the slowness of them was in keeping with everything else about that valley. Nothing happened suddenly here. Everything had its time. The rainy season came. The rains arrived with their usual announcement. 3 days of cloud building over the hills, the air thickening and cooling, the particular smell that the earth produces before rain, that smell of ancient minerals meeting water, one of the oldest and most immediately recognizable smells in the human experience. The clouds built and then released, and the rain came down across the valley in long, steady curtains that moved with the wind from west to east, crossing the sleeping village without pause. The thatch of the roofs received the rain and channeled it, as thatch is designed to do, down and away from the walls. The paths became wet and darkened, and the grass along their edges straightened and deepened its green. The river swelled gently, rising a hand's width up its banks, running slightly faster, slightly louder, a deeper note in its usual voice, a rounder fullness in its movement. The rain fell on the sleeping faces of anyone whose hut had an open doorway. It fell lightly, in the way that the edge of a rainstorm falls. Not the driving center of it, but the scattered peripheral drops that arrive and advance like scouts. These drops fell on cheeks and brows and the backs of open hands, and were absorbed without response, without the flinch or the turn that an ordinary sleeper makes when something touches their face in the night. The sleeping was deeper than rain. The sleeping was deeper than anything the ordinary world produced, and the ordinary world, recognizing this, continued its business around and above and beside the village without asking anything of it. The rain fell, the sun came back, the river subsided, the fields unplanted that season, filled instead with wild grass and the small, determined flowers that appear after rain in places where the soil has been worked and is therefore richer than the ground around it. The flowers were beautiful. There was no one to see them, which did not make them less beautiful. It made them in a particular way, more so the beauty that exists entirely for its own sake, witnessed only by the bees and the butterflies and the small birds that move through the village's quiet fields in the weeks after rain, as if the whole place had been prepared especially for them. 6 months in, something became clear that had not been clear before. The village was not deteriorating. This is the thing that should be said plainly, because it is the most important thing about the nature of the sleep, the thing that distinguished it from ordinary abandonment, from the ordinary process by which built things decay, when the people who built them are no longer present to maintain them. An ordinary abandoned village loses its battle with time at a pace that is painful to witness. Roofs collapse in the first heavy rains without someone to repair them. Walls crack and crumble. Floors are undermined by the roots of plants that find their way in. Insects and rodents take up residence and do what insects and rodents do in places where no one is contesting their presence. None of this was happening here. The roofs were still whole. The walls were still solid. The floors of the huts were still packed earth, firm and uncracked, exactly as they had been the night the stranger left. The tools leaning against walls leaned still, not rusted, not rotted, not claimed by the slow chemistry of abandonment. The clay pots beside the doorways held their shape and their color. The cloth folded in the storage areas had not been touched by the moths that should, by any ordinary reckoning, have found it within the first few weeks. The village was being held, not by any visible mechanism, not by any material intervention. The holding was of a different kind. The kind that has no adequate word in most languages, the kind that the old woman might have recognized if she had been awake to see it, because it was a quality she had understood all her life without having a name for it. The quality of a place that has been loved long enough that the love itself becomes structural, becomes load-bearing. The village had been loved carefully and daily for longer than anyone could remember. And that love accumulated in the swept paths and the tended fires and the shared meals and the stories told on a great tree and the particular attention with which the potters shaped their pots and the weavers set their patterns. That love had become, in some sense, the mortar between the stones, the thing that held the shape of the place even in the absence of the people who had built the shape. The stranger had not put them in a cage. He had put them in something more like an embrace that was strong enough to hold the village and everything in it exactly as it was, for exactly as long as was needed, until the time came when it could be released. Inside the huts, the dreams continued, what the people of the village dreamed across those months and years. This is where the story becomes the most mysterious and the most beautiful and the least reducible to ordinary telling, because dreams are not stories in the way that events are stories. They have their own logic, their own geography, their own time, which does not run parallel to the time of the waking world. What could be said is this: they were not nightmares. The faces of the sleepers did not speak of nightmares. There was no sweating, no crying out, no the sudden muscular jerk of a body responding to a dream fall. The children murmured their small murmurs and shifted their small shifts, but the quality of it, the emotional quality, visible in the faces and the bodies, in a particular way each person held themselves even in complete unconsciousness, was a quality of something pleasant, something involving, something that held the dreamer's attention from the inside in a way that only the very best experiences of a waking life managed to hold it from the outside. Perhaps they were dreaming their own lives. The particular joy of a remembered morning, the smell of the fire coaxed back from embers, the sound of the river in the rainy season, the weight of a child tucked against the chest in the small hours. Perhaps they were dreaming forward into possibilities their waking lives had not yet had time to reach, futures as warm and as real as their pasts, unfolding in the private theater of the sleeping mind with the leisurely fullness that only dreams allow. Perhaps they were dreaming something that has no equivalent in waking life at all, something that belongs only to that particular depth of sleep. That depth a stranger's gift had opened in them like a door into a room they had always had in the house of themselves, but had never before found the key to. The old woman, it can be said, was smiling, not dramatically, not the wide, announced smile of someone experiencing visible joy, subtly, just at the corners of her extraordinary mouth, just the faintest upward suggestion, the smile of someone who, in whatever inner landscape they were inhabiting, had encountered something that confirmed something they had always suspected but never quite been certain of. The smile of someone who finally knows. A year passed, and then another, and then another, and with each year, the conversation between the village and the living world around it grew gradually, tenderly, irresistibly more intimate. The great tree at the center of the village sent new roots into the gathering space, not aggressively, not with the destructive force that tree roots can sometimes bring to the built world. Gently, finding the spaces between the stones of the fire ring that the small plant had already found, widening them slightly, settling into them. The tree's canopy, already enormous, spread further. New branches grew outward over the huts at the center of the village, extending the tree's shade to places it hadn't quite reached before. The tree was not taking the village. It was joining it more completely than it had ever been able before. Vines appeared at the bases of the hut walls. The particular vines that grow on African earth in warm, wet places, the ones with leaves the shape and size of an outstretched hand, deep green and glossy, that cling to surfaces with small, determined rootlets and climb without asking permission. They grew up the eastern walls first, where the morning sun warmed the clay and made it the most inviting surface available. They moved slowly, an inch a week, perhaps less, patient as everything in the valley had learned to be patient. The animals came, not the village's own animals. The goats and chickens were still in their enclosures, still sleeping, still whole, alive, and breathing in their slow, steady way. But the wild animals of the surrounding valley began, over the months and years, to move more freely in the spaces between and around the huts. The small antelope from the river's edge grazed in the fields where the wild grass had grown thick and sweet. A family of mongoose established themselves in the space beneath the raised granary platform, moving in with the pragmatic confidence of creatures that have found an excellent location and see no reason not to use it. Birds nested everywhere, in the thatch, in the eaves, in the angles between the hut walls and the overhanging branches of the expanding tree. By the end of the second year, the village had become, for the birds of the valley, one of the most desirable addresses available. The sound of it, which had been bird silent the morning after the sleep fell, was now, in the early hours, extraordinary. Layer upon layer of song from dozens of species, filling the valley above the sleeping rooftops with a canopy of sound as dense and various and beautiful as the canopy of the great tree itself. The village breathed in this sound. The sleepers breathed in the air that moved through it. Now scented differently than it had been a year before, carrying the green smell of the vines and the earth smell of the wild grasses, and the river smelled that the slight shift in the waterway's course had moved a little closer. It was a richer air than it had been, a more alive air, and the sleep, receiving it, deepened in a way that paradoxically made it seem lighter, made it seem, from the outside, less like the deep stillness of suspended time and more like the ordinary sleep of a village resting well. If you could ignore the fact that no one had woken for 2 years, that the fires hadn't burned, that the paths hadn't been swept, that the seasons had cycled through their full rounds twice now, without a single face appearing at a single doorway. If you could ignore all of that, the village looked almost like it might wake at any moment. 5 years in, 10, 25, the vines had reached the rooftops of several huts and were beginning their exploration of the thatch with the slow, thorough attention of someone reading a beloved book for the second time. They found it welcoming. The thatch and the vine had been moving toward each other for long enough now that they had begun to interweave. The dry grass of the thatch and the green tendrils of the vine finding each other and making something new of the meeting. Something that was neither pure thatch nor pure vine, but a third thing, a living roof, a roof that breathed. The great tree's newest branches had grown over the central gathering space entirely, closing the gap between the tree's canopy and the sky above the hearth, making the gathering space now a green roof room. The fire ring at the center was no longer visible beneath the layer of leaves and roots and the small plant that had grown, over 25 years, into a substantial shrub with woody stems and deep roots and a confident relationship with the stones it had been growing through for longer than most things grow through anything. The river, in its gradual eastward drift, had reached the edge of the nearest field. In wet seasons, the field's lower corner filled with water and became, temporarily, a small marshy area that the water birds found irresistible. Herons standing in it on one leg with a particular patience that herons bring to the business of waiting. Egrets moving through it with a deliberate, high-stepping elegance of creatures who find the whole world slightly beneath their dignity. The sleeping people did not know about the herons. They did not know about the vines on their rooftops or the mongoose under the granary, or the way the great tree had extended itself over their gathering space, making the place where they had shared so many stories into a cathedral of branches and leaves and bird call. They did not know that outside their dreaming, 50 years had passed and the world had continued without them, that generations had lived and died beyond the hills that held their valley, that languages had shifted and borders had moved, and the names of things had changed in the slow, unstoppable way that names always change. They knew none of it. They knew only the warmth and the dark of the deep sleep and the dreams, still present, still warm, still holding each of them in the specific and personal landscape of their own interior world, still giving them, night after night, in the endless night they were living, the experience of being completely, entirely, unconditionally at rest. At 50 years, something changed in the valley, not in the village. The village continued its slow, green conversation with the world around it, unchanged in any fundamental way, whole and held and still breathing. But in the land beyond the hills, a path that had once connected the valley to the wider network of roads and settlements had disappeared, not through any dramatic event, not a flood or a landslide or deliberate closure, simply through disuse. The path had existed because people walked it. When the people of the valley stopped walking it, the grass reclaimed it at the same steady pace it reclaimed everything, and within a generation, there was no visible trace of it. Someone who had known the way in their childhood might have found their way back by memory, by feel, by the particular quality of the light through those western trees, by the sound of the river that became audible once you were close enough to the hills. But someone who had not been this way before would find nothing to follow. The valley had become, in the practical sense of the everyday world, unfindable. This had always been true, in a way, always been a quality of the place. Some natural tendency toward remaining itself without becoming widely known. But now it was more completely true. The landmarks that might have pointed a traveler in the right direction had been reclaimed or had changed. The names that people in the surrounding area had used of the valley, and there had been names once, though they were fading now, were no longer in common use. The older people who remembered hearing the valley spoken by their parents were old now, and their memories of a name they had heard once or twice in childhood were uncertain, more like the memory of a dream than the memory of a fact. The world forgot. This is not as sad as it sounds. In the context of a place that was resting, a place that needed to be forgotten for a while, in order to do what it was doing, the forgetting was part of it, part of the gift the stranger had given, which was not only the sleep, but the space around the sleep, the protection of being for a time outside the ordinary world's reach, outside its demands and its movements and its noise. The valley held the village, the hills held the valley, and the sleep continued. On the 100th year, the light in the valley changed, not suddenly, not all at once. It was the kind of change that you notice only after it has been happening for some time, like the way a room changes when someone slowly, imperceptibly raises a window blind, letting in light so gradually that there is no single moment you can point to and say, there, that was the moment it became brighter. You simply realize at some point that it is brighter than it was, and has been for a while. The light in the valley had this quality, a slight shift in the quality of the gold that fell through the tree canopy onto the central gathering space. A slight change in the color of the shadows inside the huts, less deep, less absolute, more permeable, as if something in the nature of the light itself had decided that its orientation to this place was different now than it had been, as if the sun had noticed something and adjusted. Inside the huts, the breathing of the sleepers changed, so slightly that no instrument in the world would have measured the difference in that particular moment. But it changed. The interval between the in-breath and the out-breath grew fractionally shorter. The depth of each breath fractionally greater. Some adjustment was happening at the level below consciousness, below the dreaming. In the ancient, wordless part of the body that knows things it was never told and manages things it was never asked to manage. The sleep was listening. Something was coming. Something that would enter the valley as a stranger had entered it. From a direction no one expected. Something that would walk into the particular quality of that air and the particular quality of that silence and feel in the way that certain people feel certain things when they enter certain places. That something here was waiting. The village slept on. But in the quality of the sleeping now, there was something new. Something that was not quite wakefulness, but was no longer the absolute depth of the first night. Something in the neighborhood of readiness. The readiness of a door that is still closed, but whose latch has been quietly lifted. That moment before the opening, when the potential for it exists fully and only the touch is missing. The 100th year was ending, and somewhere beyond the hills, along a path that no longer existed, but whose ghost remained in the land, a traveler was walking. Chapter 4. The traveler, the waking, and the world that waited. The traveler had not been looking for the village. This is important to understand, because the stories that come later, the ones people tell after something extraordinary happens, after the shape of an event becomes clear enough to be passed around in words, those stories always make it sound inevitable. They make it sound as if the traveler had been called, had been chosen, had been moving toward that valley since the beginning of their journey with some quiet foreknowledge of what they would find at the end of it. But that is the story after the fact. That is the story shaped by the knowledge of what happened, working backward to make the path look straight when it was anything but. The truth is simpler and, in its simplicity, more beautiful. The traveler was lost. He was a storyteller by trade, or had been once. In the years before his feet had taken him further from home than he had intended to go, he had started as a young man with a good memory and a gift for a voice, moving between settlements of the region, carrying news and stories, and the particular kind of company that a skilled storyteller offers to communities that have been in their own company for too long. He had been welcomed everywhere he went, fed and sheltered in exchange for an evening's telling. And the life had suited him well enough that he had continued it past the age when most men of his acquaintance had settled into the stationary routines of family and permanence. He was not young anymore. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and the road had put a permanent weathering into the skin of his face and hands that no amount of shade or rest ever quite removed. He walked with the easy, ground-covering stride of someone who had spent decades learning how to travel without wasting effort. Not fast, but steady, with the kind of efficiency that comes from understanding your own body's rhythms and working with them rather than against them. He carried a bag worn smooth with use and a staff not entirely unlike the one the stranger had carried 100 years before, along the same direction of the same hills. He wore sandals that had been resoled so many times the original material was more memory than substance. He carried in his head several hundred stories in various stages of completion, a reliable sense of direction, and the accumulated map of a region he had been walking for 30 years. This is why being lost was so disorienting. He had been moving through a part of the landscape he thought he knew or had known once. In his younger years when he had traveled further and more carelessly than he did now. He had been trying to reach a settlement that lay, in his memory, roughly half a day's walk to the east. But the path he had been following had simply stopped, had thinned and thinned until it was indistinguishable from the general grass of the hillside, and then had been nothing at all. And now he was standing on a hill in the late afternoon with the sun moving toward the western horizon behind him and no clear indication of which way to go. He was not panicking. He was too old for panic and too experienced. He was simply considering. He looked at the sky. He looked at the vegetation. He listened. With the careful attention of someone who has spent enough years outdoors to know that the land speaks if you know how to receive what it is saying. And then, quite faintly, from somewhere below and to the east, he heard something that was not the wind, and not a bird, and not the sound of his own movement through the grass. He heard water, a river, moving over stones, in the unhurried way that rivers move when they're not in a hurry, which is most of the time. A low, continuous, foundational sound. The sound of water that has been where it is for a very long time and fully intends to remain. He followed it. The descent into the valley took the better part of an hour. The hillside was steep in places, and the vegetation, which had not been cleared by any human hand in longer than anyone could have told him, was dense and required navigation rather than simple walking. He moved through it methodically, the way he moved through everything, without impatience, attending what was directly in front of him rather than what lay at the bottom. The sound of the river grew as he descended. The air changed, cooler, and carrying the green smell of water and living things. The smell of a valley that holds moisture even at the end of the dry season because its geography is shaped in the right way to keep what the rains bring. He came through the last of the dense growth at the bottom of the hill and stepped out onto the edge of a valley. He stopped. He stood very still for a long moment, looking. The valley was beautiful. He had been in many valleys, and this was beautiful in a particular way that places are beautiful when they've been left entirely alone. When the human impulse to tidy and demarcate and impose a logic on the landscape has been absent long enough for the landscape to find its own. The grass was thick and various. Wildflowers were scattered through it in the easy, unplanned abundance of things that grow where they want. The river moved along the valley's lower edge, catching the late afternoon light in brief, bright flashes as it went. And in the center of the valley, half hidden by trees and the vines that had grown over and around and between them, there was a village. He did not immediately understand what he was seeing. The shapes were familiar enough. He knew what a hut looked like. He knew what a gathering space looked like. He knew the general architecture of a settled community, and the shapes in front of him conformed to it in their basic outlines. But those outlines have been complicated by 100 years of patient natural growth, and the complication was so complete that the village looked at first like something you might have imagined, something that existed in the borderland between built and grown, between made and found, between the work of human hands and the work of everything else. The great tree at the center of the gathering space was the first thing he recognized as clearly intentional. Trees that size don't grow in the middle of nowhere. Trees that size grow in the middle of somewhere, in the middle of a place that has given them what they needed for a very long time and been given something in return. He moved toward it slowly. The paths were still there. This was the first thing that stopped him, that slowed his already careful approach to something even more considered. Underneath the grass they'd grown along their edges, underneath the gentle invasion of the vine roots and the pushed-up earth of the trees' expanding root system, the paths were still there. Their essential shape remained in the ground, the slight compaction of soil that generations of feet create, and that persists long after the feet have stopped, the way a memory persists in a body long after the event that created it has ended. He stood on one of these paths and felt, through the soles of the sandals, the firmness of it, the particular quality of ground that has been walked. His storyteller's instinct, the part of him that had spent decades learning to read an audience, to feel the temperature of a room, to know what was wanted and what was true, that instinct said very quietly but very clearly, "Something is here." He walked further in. The vine-covered huts were whole. He could see this as he moved between them, reaching out to touch the wall of the nearest one. His palm finding the clay beneath the vines, finding it solid and smooth and entirely intact. He looked at the roof, the extraordinary living roof of thatch interwoven with vine, green and dry together, a roof that was somehow still keeping the shape of what had been built to be even as it had become something new and growing. He looked through an open doorway, and there, on a sleeping mat in the warm, still interior air of the hut, he saw a woman sleeping. He stood there for a very long time. His heart was doing something unusual, not racing. That would have been the wrong word for what his heart was doing. It was something more like the feeling of arriving somewhere after a very long journey, a recognition. Though he had never been here and had never seen this woman before, a recognition not of the specific, but of the kind. The recognition of something he had always known existed and had perhaps, on some level, been looking for without having a name for what he was looking for. He moved quietly away from the doorway. He moved through the village slowly, looking into each space he passed. Sleeping figures in every hut, an elder circle, settled under the great tree, their bodies arranged in the positions of people who had sat down to talk and had found, somewhere in the talking, that the sitting down led eventually and naturally to lying down, and the lying down had led here to this perfect, complete, absolute rest. He saw the children tucked against their parents. He saw the tools leaning against walls. He saw the clay pots by the doorways, still whole, still holding their color and their shape. He saw the cold hearth at the center of the gathering space and the shrub that had grown through the stones of the fire ring, its woody stems thick now with the confidence of something that has been growing for a very long time. He sat down. He sat on one of the great tree's roots, one of those sweeping, muscular curves of root that rose from the ground before diving back down. And he sat in a way that the situation required, which was without agenda, without the immediate need to understand or explain or do anything at all. He simply sat in the middle of this extraordinary village and let the reality of it land on him at whatever pace it chose. The birds would have fallen briefly silent when he entered. The natural silence of birds when something unfamiliar moves into their space, resumed their singing. A mongoose looked at him from the edge of the granary platform with flat, direct assessment, decided he was not worth further concern, and disappeared back underneath it. The river ran. The late afternoon light fell through the tree canopy in shifting, dappled patterns that moved across the sleeping figures and the swept but overgrown paths, and the vine-covered walls of the same democratic, indifferent beauty that light brings to everything it touches. He sat for a long time. It happened, As most significant things happen, without intention, he had been sitting in the gathering space for some time, long enough for the light to change, for the afternoon gold to begin its shift toward the softer, cooler tones of approaching evening. He had been still, out an instinct he couldn't have named, an instinct that said, whatever this is, it requires stillness. It requires presence without disturbance. Be here without imposing yourself on what is here. But he was a storyteller. And the thing about storytellers, the thing that makes them what they are rather than simply people with good memories and pleasant voices, is that the stories move through them in a way that is not entirely under their control. They surface. They rise up from wherever stories live inside a person, from that deep, warm place that stories share with music and with prayer, and they find a mouth and they come out. He had not decided to speak, but he found at some point that he was speaking, not loudly, very quietly, in the low, steady, unhurried voice of a storyteller who is telling a story not for an audience but for himself. The way a person talks quietly in a place that feels sacred, where the sound they make is less about communicating and more about being present, about adding their own small voice to the voices of the place. He told a story. He told the story of a valley he had once heard described, long ago, a valley that a very old traveler had mentioned to him when he was still young and new to the road, a valley with a river and two gentle hills and a village at its center that felt, the old traveler had said, like the most rested place in the world. He had always remembered that description, had carried it for decades, had looked in a general and unfocused way for a valley that matched it whenever the road took him into the country. He told it quietly to the sleeping village and the listening birds and the patient tree. His voice moved through the gathering space like water, finding its own level, filling the available space without forcing itself into corners, touching the walls and the sleeping figures and the vine-covered rooftops and the cold hearth with equal, undemanding gentleness. And as he spoke, the light continued to change, and something in the quality of the air continued to change with it. The old woman's hand moved first. It was a small movement. The fingers of her right hand, which had been lying open and still on the ground beside her for 100 years, closing slightly, curling inward, the movement of a hand that is beginning to remember it as a hand. Then a breath, deeper than the breath that sustained her through the long sleep, a breath that had intention in it, the intention of a body gathering itself, preparing. Then her eyes, they opened slowly, the way eyes open when someone has been truly, deeply asleep and is returning from a great distance, not the snap awake of interrupted sleep, not the groggy confusion of a difficult waking, the gradual, layered opening of someone returning through depth, rise into the layers of sleep the way a diver rises through water, unhurried, attending to the return. She looked at the canopy of the great tree above her. She looked at it for a long moment, long enough that the complete strangeness of how it appeared had time to reach her. The canopy had always been large. It had not always been this large. The branches she was looking through to the evening sky above were branches she did not recognize, grown since the last time she had looked up from this spot in the ways that only decades of growing produce. She did not understand this yet. Understanding would come later. What she felt first, before understanding, was the aliveness of the moment, the particular, unmistakable feeling of being present in a body, in a place, in a time of being here, specifically here, in this specific evening air with this specific light coming through these specific leaves, and the sound of the river in the distance, and the smell of green and earth, and the very faint warmth of the ground beneath her. She sat up slowly. Around her, the circle was stirring. It happened gently, and it happened everywhere at once. The way that dawn happens in a forest, not a single moment of light, but 1,000 small moments accumulating into the fact of morning, each one adding its increment to what is becoming, until what is becoming is fully, simply, what is. A child turned over and opened their eyes and looked at the vine-covered ceiling of their hut, and made the small, wondering sound that children make when they encounter something they are sure they have seen before, but cannot quite place. A young farmer on the path between two huts pushed himself to sitting with the automatic movement of a body that has done this every morning for years, and is doing it again now without requiring instruction. An elder stretched, fully, completely, with a whole body luxury of a stretch after a very long rest. And the sound was the most ordinary sound in the world, and also, in that moment, the most extraordinary. The animals stirred. The goats were the first of the village's animals to find their voices. Of course they were, because goats are nothing if not urgent, and a goat that has been asleep for any amount of time has urgent opinions about this upon waking. Their voices rose from the enclosures with their usual impatient authority, and the sound of them moved through the waking village like an announcement, like a bell, like the signal that something, everything, was resuming. The chickens erupted, and at the sound of the chickens, at that famously ridiculous, famously exuberant sound of poultry, discovering once again that the world still exists, the storyteller stopped speaking. He stood. He turned slowly in the gathering space, watching the village come back to itself with the stunned, grateful attention of a person who is witnessing something they have no framework for, and has the good sense to know that framework is not what is needed right now. What is needed right now is simply to see, to receive what is happening with every sense fully open and no part of the mind busy with explanation. The people coming through the doorways of their huts were doing the thing people do when they wake from a long sleep in a familiar place, looking around with the slightly confused benevolence of someone who knows where they are but cannot quite account for quality of the light, the slight strangeness of the hour, the sense that more time has passed than their body can fully explain. They looked at the vines on their walls. They looked at the trees' expanded canopy. They looked at the wild grass in the paths and the shrub grown to the fire ring and the birds. The extraordinary number of birds in every tree and eave and rooftop, filling the air with the evening song that the birds of that valley have been refining for 100 years in the comfortable absence of any audience other than their own kind. They looked at all of this with the careful, quiet attention of people who know they are seeing something that requires consideration. People who are not frightened, because the village still felt like the village, because the air was still the air of home, because nothing in the essential quality of the place had changed, only the surface of it, but who understand that something has shifted in a way they cannot yet name. And then they saw the traveler. The old woman was the one who walked toward him. Of course it was her. She walked with the authority of 100 years and 1,000 more. The authority of someone who has looked at unusual things for a very long time and made peace with the fact that the world contains more of the unusual than is comfortable to acknowledge, and that the discomfort is not a reason to look away. She stood before him. He stood before her. He had no idea what to say. He was a man who had never been without words in his adult life. And he stood in front of this woman in this village, in this impossible situation, and had absolutely nothing. The stories had left him. The words had gone quiet. All of it, the 30 years of language and narrative and the shape-telling of things, had gone still inside him, the way the wind goes still before a storm. Except there was no storm coming. There was only this. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked him in the direct way that she had always asked things, that she had been asking things her whole life with the same efficient, genuine curiosity. She asked him, how long? He understood the question. He told her as gently as he could, which was still quite direct, because gentleness sometimes requires directness, because the careful softening of a hard truth can sometimes be less kind than the truth itself plainly stated. He told her 100 years. She was quiet. She looked up at the great tree's expanded canopy, the branches she had not seen grow, the fullness of a century's growth visible from where she stood in a way that confirmed the number he had given her, without requiring her to simply take his word for it. She looked at the vines on the huts. She looked at the wild grass. She looked at the river, whose course from where she stood seemed slightly different, slightly further east. She nodded, not the nod of acceptance, not the nod of someone who has made peace with something, the nod of someone who is receiving information and putting it in its correct place, the nod of someone who will think about this for a long time, but is not going to perform her thinking for an audience. She asked him, "Are you hungry?" He laughed. He could not help it. He laughed with the full, helpless, delighted laughter of someone who has just been given an absolutely perfect response to an impossible situation. Someone who expected confusion and received instead the simple, beautiful practicality of a person for whom the ordinary business of caring for people in front of them is always the first priority, regardless of what extraordinary things are happening around the edges of that ordinary business. He told her yes. He was very hungry, she said. Then come and turn back toward the village. The fire was rebuilt that evening, new wood brought from the edge of the valley, carried on the shoulders of people who moved with the easy muscle memory of people who had done this 10,000 times before, who did not need to think about the weight or the distance because their bodies already knew both. The stones of the fire ring were clear of the shrub that had grown through them, not destroyed, not ripped out, but carefully loosened and moved to the edge of the gathering space, where it was replanted with the kind of consideration that the village had always brought to living things. The shrub had earned its place here in its way. It had kept the fire ring company for 100 years. It was not going to be discarded carelessly. The fire took easily. It always had. And the light it threw across the gathering space, across the faces of the people settling into the familiar positions of an evening circle, across the great tree's roots and the vine-covered huts and the swept, beginning to be swept again, paths, was the same light that fire has always thrown across the human circle, warm, alive, slightly dancing, partial, illuminating what is nearest and letting everything else exist in its own quality of darkness, without demanding that the darkness explain itself. The storyteller sat in the circle, not at its center. That was not his place, not tonight or ever in this particular gathering. He sat at its edge, where a guest sits, where someone new to a fire sits, where someone has arrived from elsewhere and is still learning the specific texture of this particular warm sits. He sat and he listened because they talked. Of course they talked. A village coming back to itself after a long absence talks the way a river talks after rain, with everything at once, with the full, urgent, overflowing energy of things that have been waiting to move and are moving now. They talk about what they saw and what was different, and what was strange, and what the vines and the grass and the river's slight shift in course meant to the people who understood what those things meant. They talked about what they had dreamed, and the telling of the dreams went on for a long time, each person adding their own, the dreams layering on top of each other like the songs of birds in the morning, each one distinct, but together making something that was more than the sum of its parts. They talked about the stranger. Of course they talk about the stranger. The old woman told it first, how he had come from the western path in the dying light, how he had moved, how his feet were bare and his staff was smooth, and his eyes were the oldest things she had ever seen. She told it simply and exactly, as she told everything. And when she got to the part where he had spoken, the words he had said about the valley being a right place, about resting, the circle went very quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the quiet of people receiving something, putting it in the right place. The storyteller listened to all of this. He was doing what he had always done, in every circle he had ever sat in, listening with the full, specific, retentive attention of someone who knows that a story heard carefully enough, held long enough, belongs eventually to everyone. He was listening in a way that stories are made, not with analysis, not with judgment, but with the whole open quality of a mind that has decided to receive rather than to process. He was going to carry this story. He did not know yet where he would carry it, or who he would carry it to, or how many years would pass before he found the right fire and the right circle and the right moment to open his mouth and let it out. He did not know that it would be the story that defined the rest of his traveling life. The story people would ask for by name, the story that arrived before he did in the places he was going, the story that would outlast him by so many generations, it would eventually become something that nobody had written and everybody knew. He did not know any of this yet. He knew only that the fire was warm and the circle was alive, and the stars above the valley were the same stars they had always been. Patient, permanent, indifferent to time in a way that only things old enough to have watched 100,000 human stories unfold can afford to be indifferent. He stayed 3 days. 3 days of eating what the village had and helping where his hands were useful and listening to everything that was said around the fire in the evenings with his full, unhurried attention. 3 days of watching the village resume itself, watching the paths being swept again, the fires being tended, the potters returning to the river clay with the purposeful attention of people returning to something they love. 3 days of watching the children relearn the village the way children relearn places after an absence, running through it with a particular energy of people who are simultaneously remembering and discovering. Their games complex with the geography of a place they know in their bones, but are seeing newly. On the morning of the 4th day, he said his farewell. The old woman walked with him to the edge of the village, to the place where the swept path ended and the unswept grass began, the clear line between the tended and the wild that the village was already drawing again around itself. She walked with the unhurried step of someone for whom this kind of farewell was entirely familiar, who had seen people arrive and leave across the long span of a life that had now, impossibly, extended further than she had expected. She said, "You will tell it." Not a question. He said yes. She looked at him for a moment, with those eyes that had been looking at the world carefully for longer than most eyes get to look at it. She looked at him the way she had looked at the stranger 100 years ago, across a fire, the way she looked at everything that deserved to be looked at carefully. She said, "Tell it right." He said he would do his best. She nodded. Then she turned and walked back into the village without looking back, with the ease of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has no need to watch the departure of what is leaving in order to feel comfortable with its absence. He watched her go. He watched until she had passed a great tree and gone beyond it, becoming one of the moving shapes of the morning village. Indistinguishable from the other moving shapes, absorbed back into the life of the place the way a drop of water is absorbed back into the river it fell from, without loss, without trace, simply returned. Then he turned east. He walked. The valley held the village. The hills held the valley. The river ran with a slight eastward drift that had developed over 100 years. And the birds sang in the extraordinary layered way they had been refining since long, before any human ear was present to receive it. And the great tree spread its canopy over the gathering space where, every evening now, a fire burned again, and the circle assembled again, and the stories moved through the warm air between the people who had always known how to tend them. The vine stayed. This is worth saying. The village did not tear them down, did not strip the walls back to bare clay, and pretend the 100 years had not happened. The vines were living things that had grown here honestly, in good faith, doing what living things do when given time and warmth and a surface worth climbing. They stayed. The village grew around them and alongside them, making a place that was neither what it had been before the sleet, nor something entirely different. But third thing, the thing that is made when time is allowed to work on something without destroying it. The thing that is made when a life continues through an interval of deep rest and comes out the other side carrying the rest inside it as something that cannot be seen but can be felt. In the quality of the morning, in the quality of the silence, in the quality of the particular peace that belongs to people who have, at the very deepest level themselves, been genuinely, completely rested. Time moved differently there. It had always moved differently there. Everyone who ever visited said this. In one form or another, the storyteller said it. The few other travelers who found their way into that valley over the generations that followed said it. Not that time moved slowly. Exactly. Not that the days were long or the seasons sluggish. More that the time in that valley had a quality of fullness that time elsewhere sometimes lacked. As if each hour contained its full hour, without the parts that time usually loses when it is spent under pressure or in noise or in the anxious management of too many competing demands. As if the sleep had taught the valley something about how time could be, and the valley, having learned it, had kept it. The children who grew up there noticed it only when they left, noticed that the world beyond the hills moved differently, felt differently, had a quality of urgency and incompleteness that they had never experienced inside the valley. Some of them stayed for this reason. Some of them left anyway, because the world beyond the hills also had things inside it that the valley did not, and the pull of those things was real and worth following. But they always knew the way back. The path was clear again, had been clear again since the first morning after the waking, when the feet of the village had begun the process of pressing it back into the earth. And once a path exists in the feet of the people who walk it, it exists. It cannot be fully erased by grass or time or the indifference of the wider world. It can be obscured. It can become difficult to follow, but it cannot be made not to exist. The way home, once you know it, always remains. This is the end of the story. Or rather, this is where the story opens its hand and lets you go, because stories like this one do not really end. They do the thing that the best stories always do, which is to reach a place of rest and then leave the door slightly open, not to pull you back through it, not to demand continuation, but simply to acknowledge that the world in which the story happened is still out there, still warm, still breathing. The village is still in the valley. The valley is still in the hills. The hills are still cupping the valley in their green, patient, enduring embrace. The fire is still burning at the center of the gathering space. And somewhere, perhaps, a traveler is walking along a hillside path, following the sound of a river they can hear, but not yet see, descending towards something they were not looking for and will not know how to name when they find it, moving in the unhurried way of someone who's given up on arriving and is simply walking, going exactly where they need to go. Wherever you are right now, whatever corner of this wide, complicated, beautiful world you have found your quiet in tonight, I hope you feel something of what that valley held. That quality of being held. That quality of being somewhere where time has been given permission to be full. To move at the pace of breath rather than the pace of everything that is waiting to be done. That quality of fire that has been burning in the same place for longer than anyone can quite account for, and is in no danger going out. You don't have to do anything with this. You don't have to remember every detail, or carry the whole story perfectly, or be able to tell it exactly as it was told to you. The stories that mattered don't require perfect transmission. They require only that something in you receive them, held them in whatever way your particular self holds things, and let them do whatever they came to do. The old woman knew that. The storyteller knew it. The stranger, walking away through the western grass with his bare feet and his smooth staff and his eyes full of things too old to name. He knew it most of all. Let your body be as still as the village was in its best, deepest, most complete resting. Let your breath find the pace of the river, steady, unhurried, going where it goes without urgency or effort, simply following the path of least resistance toward the sea. The fire is low, the stars are out, the great tree is spreading its canopy above you in the dark, and its roots are old and its branches are wide, and everything beneath it is, for this moment and for as long as you need it to be, entirely, perfectly safe. Sleep well. The valley is still there, and so are you. Good night.